The doctrine of mutual recognition and acquiescence is very similar in nature to the doctrine of agreed boundaries, but with one key distinction. To see that distinction, let's consider our Jacob and Sarah hypothetical again. This time, let's assume that Jacob wants to plant a series of trees in order to mark the common boundary line between their two parcels. Let's also assume that this time, Jacob and Sarah never had any conversation at all. Jacob just didn't want to pay for a new survey, and so he planted the trees where he thought the true boundary line actually was, without getting Sarah's input. Unfortunately, Jacob planted the trees so that they encroached onto Sarah's land by about 3 feet. Once the trees were planted, Sarah never complained about their location. For the next 12 years, in fact, both of them maintained their respective yards as if the trees marked the boundary line. Neither Jacob nor Sarah knew of the mistake until last week, when Sarah got a new survey done because she was about to expand her house. The survey revealed the encroachment, and Sarah immediately told Jacob that she planned to cut the trees down and build a fence on the correct boundary line. Can Jacob prevent her from doing that? The agreed boundaries doctrine wouldn't help Jacob here, as he couldn't prove that Sarah had ever expressly agreed that the tree line should constitute the boundary between their parcels. But he could use the doctrine of mutual recognition and acquiescence. Like the agreed boundaries doctrine, mutual recognition and acquiescence allows for the relocation of a boundary line even without the execution and delivery of deeds of conveyance. To establish a boundary by mutual recognition and acquiescence, Jacob would have to show that there's a visible and well-defined line or monument, such as a road, a fence, or in this case, a tree line, that despite the lack of an express agreement, the adjoining landowners have by their conduct manifested a mutual recognition and acceptance of that line or monument as the true boundary line, and that this recognition and acceptance has continued for the statutory period required to establish title by adverse possession. Under the doctrine of mutual recognition and acquiescence, if Jacob can demonstrate that Sarah's conduct reflects her acceptance of the line of trees as the boundary line between their parcels, and if the state's statutory adverse possession period is 12 years or less, then Jacob can successfully argue that the line of trees has become the true boundary line between the parcels. If you're wondering why the law even needs a doctrine called mutual recognition and acquiescence, then good for you. In this example, it looks like Jacob could essentially claim title by adverse possession. For 12 years, he's physically occupied this 3-foot strip of land in a fashion that was visible, exclusive, uninterrupted, and perfectly consistent with the sort of behavior we would expect a true owner of lands to make. The explanation for a separate doctrine lies with confusion over whether Jacob's claim might be sufficiently hostile to satisfy the adverse possession standard. If the parties, by their conduct, have recognized the trees as the boundary line, then Sarah might argue that Jacob's possession has really been with her implied consent, and thus that it lacks the necessary hostility to satisfy the adverse possession standard. Or perhaps Sarah might argue that if Jacob had known where the true boundary line was in the first place, he'd have never planted the trees where he did, suggesting that he lacked the intent necessary to claim title to this strip of land. A separate doctrine of mutual recognition and acquiescence thus allows the court to protect Jacob's long-standing expectations either way. It could characterize his possession as objectively hostile and award Jacob title by adverse possession, or the court could characterize his possession as being based upon implied consent, and yet still award him title based upon Sarah's long-standing acquiescence in the line of trees as marking the true boundary line. Under the doctrine of mutual recognition and acquiescence, notice that there must be conduct that demonstrates that both parties have recognized the particular line as the common boundary. Because the doctrine depends upon the notion of implied consent or implied agreement, conduct by only one of the parties would not be good enough. The cases have split as to whether silence by itself will be sufficient to establish that recognition. Some cases have held that silence is enough, while others require more overt statements or actions that demonstrate recognition of the line as a boundary line.